How are we doing, class? This is the second section of the reading. It is titled Evil and Suffering May Be, If Anything, Evidence for God. This is very interesting because in the previous section, it was all about how evil and suffering, is Tim Keller tries to explain how evil and suffering is not evidence against God, and now he's trying to explain how evil and suffering is actually evidence for God. So here we go. Horrendous, inexplicable suffering, though it cannot disprove God, is nonetheless a problem for believers, the believer in the Bible. You have to admit that. Every Christian has to admit that evil and suffering is in some sense a problem for their faith. However, this is interesting. It is perhaps an even greater problem for unbelievers. Okay, so that's this section. This next section is all about how he's going to try to explain how evil and how suffering is a greater problem for unbelievers and less of a problem for the believer. So you need to be listening for reasons that he gives to explain why evil and suffering actually turns out to be evidence for the existence of God. And he uses quotes from C.S. Lewis to help make his point. C.S. Lewis described how he had originally rejected the idea of God because of the cruelty of life. Okay, so the cruelty of life that he witnessed, or evil and suffering, is what caused him to reject the idea of God. Then he came to realize that evil was even more problematic for his new atheism. So at first he rejected the idea of God because of suffering, and then he came to realize that evil and suffering is actually more of a problem for atheism as opposed to Christianity. In the end, he realized that suffering provided a better argument for God's existence than one against. So I'll do E/S for evil and suffering creates more of a problem for the unbeliever as opposed to the believer. So it's more of a problem for non-Christians and less of a problem for the unbeliever. So let's see how this plays out. He quotes C.S. Lewis. So this is a quote from C.S. Lewis, who used to be an atheist, and his issue with Christianity, with the existence of God, was dependent upon his idea of evil and suffering. So let's see what he says. My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. So in other words, the cruelty and the unjust things that he saw is what made him disbelieve in God. But then he has this thought. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own, which is what people who do not believe in God have to say. People who do not believe in God ultimately have to admit that there is no such thing as justice because there is no God to establish what is right and wrong. And then he says this, but if I did that, if he did what? If he said that justice, right here, was simply a private idea of his own, then his argument against God collapsed too. And this word right here, for, is the word for because. So he's giving the reason for why admitting there is no such thing as justice actually takes away his argument against the existence of God. Why? Because the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not please my private fancies. This has to do with this idea, the private idea of justice, right? Consequently, conclusion, atheism turns out to be too simple. So then Tim Keller basically explains the quote here. Lewis recognized that modern objections, that's today's objections, modern objections to God are based on a sense of fair play and justice. People, we believe, ought not to suffer, be excluded, die of hunger or oppression. But, now he's going to talk about evolution. The evolutionary mechanism of natural selection depends on death. It depends on death, destruction, and violence of the strong against the weak. These things are perfectly natural. If there is no God, and natural selection is the only thing that determines what survives, here's the thing: natural selection depends on death, it depends on destruction, it depends on violence, and it depends on strong against the weak. These things are perfectly natural, which is why it's called natural selection. And if that is the case, then, on what basis, then, does the atheist judge the natural world to be horribly wrong, unfair, and unjust? The non-believer in God doesn't have a good basis for being outraged at injustice, which, as Lewis points out, was the reason for objecting to God in the first place. The non-believer in God doesn't have a good basis for being outraged at injustice, which was the very thing in the beginning that he used to object against the existence of God. If you are sure that this natural world is unjust and filled with evil, you are assuming the reality of some extra-natural, supernatural standard by which to make your judgment. But if there's no God, this cannot be there. And now, surprise, surprise, he quotes Alvin Plantinga again. Could there really be any such thing as horrifying wickedness if there were no God and we just evolved? I don't see how. There can't be such a thing only if there is a way that rational creatures are supposed to live, obliged to live. A secular way of looking at the world has no place. A secular way of looking at the world has no place for genuine moral obligation. Secular way is just simply not believing in God. And thus no way to say there is such a thing as genuine and appalling wickedness. Accordingly, if you think there really is such a thing as horrifying wickedness, and not just an illusion of some sort, which is what they have to admit, then you have a powerful argument for the reality of God. In short, the problem of tragedy, suffering, and injustice is a problem for everyone. It's a problem for everyone. It is at least as big a problem for non-belief in God as for belief. It is therefore a mistake, though an understandable one, to think that if you abandon belief in God, it somehow makes the problem of evil easier to handle. So here's the issue. We have the problem of evil. Everyone admits that it's a problem. We all admit that it's a problem. Now, when you have a problem, you're looking for a solution. Some people try to get rid of God and just say there is no God. But this whole reading was all about how if you get rid of God, you have no more justice. You have no more absolute justice by which to judge the very God that you are not believing in. So if you get rid of God, you have no more justice, and then you can no longer judge God for allowing evil and suffering. So, in short, evil and suffering is actually a bigger problem for the atheist, for the unbeliever, as opposed to the believer. Now he begins to shift his focus on the issue of evil and suffering. A woman in my church once confronted me about sermon illustrations in which evil evil events turned out for good. She had lost a husband in an act of violence during robbery. She also had several children with severe mental emotional problems. She insisted for every here we go. She insisted for every one story in which evil turns out for good, there are 100 in which there is no conceivable silver lining. Silver lining means things work out. If you guys have ever seen Silver Linings Playbook with Bradley Cooper and Jennifer Lawrence, Bradley Cooper, the story, he's trying to turn his life around, make things turn out for good. So she's basically saying, we all have these stories about how some sort of evil turns out for good, but her thing is, for every one story, there is 100 where it doesn't turn out for good. In the same way, much of the discussion so far in this chapter, so here he's admitting something. Tim Keller's admitting something. Much of the discussion so far in this chapter may sound cold and irrelevant to a real-life sufferer, right? Because we've only been talking about the rational argument against the existence of God. People might say this, so what if suffering and evil doesn't logically disprove God? Such a person might say, I am still angry. All this philosophizing does not get the Christian God off the hook for the world's evil and suffering. In response, so now this person right here, is kind of the being much more emotional about the issue. And here's what he says. In response, the philosopher Peter Kreeft points out that the Christian God came to earth to deliberately put himself on the hook of human suffering. This is great. In Jesus Christ, God experienced the greatest depths of pain. He's talking about the cross. He's talking about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. In Jesus Christ, God experienced the greatest depths of pain. Therefore, though Christianity does not provide the reason for each experience of pain, it provides a deep resources for actually facing suffering with hope and courage rather than bitterness and despair. So, we just talked about how evil and suffering actually turns out to be evidence for God, because as soon as someone says that there is no God, there is no way to have some sort of absolute standard of justice by which to judge God. And even then, you still might have someone like this who says, so what? I don't care about all those arguments that you Christians say and try to argue for the existence of God. They still might say there's no way that God can get off the hook for all the stuff that's happened in the world. And last but not least, it says here in response to that, in Christianity, it's so unique because God himself came to the world as Jesus Christ and suffered with us. And so people who are much more emotional, like this woman here, they have great comfort in Jesus Christ, who was God and came to this world and suffered with us. So that is the end of our reading. Please email me for any questions and see the Google document for other questions to guide you in your reading.